Welcome everybody to our session on the freedom to flourish. This is a session designed for HR and business leaders who want to make their organizations more sustainable and responsible, and who want to understand how our internal practices either support or hinder broader transformation efforts. And we'll be presenting a dynamic conversation between the CEO and HR director and a group of transformation consultants to offer you the insights from our last years of research into transformation strategies in a hopefully more engaging and accessible format. And we really hope you will find the session valuable. And as always, what we're doing is entirely pro bono, and we're very happy to answer any questions through leadershipsociety.world or via LinkedIn. Just reach out. And now let's step into the office of what might be a not untypical 21st century CEO. So picture this. It's a typical morning at a company that has just published very strong annual results. And the CEO is feeling very proud, as you'd expect. But then she glances at a picture of her grandchildren sitting on her desk, and this thought is striking her. I'm hitting all my numbers, but what about my legacy? And then she glances out of the window and she kind of thinks about all the crises we're facing today, from environmental breakdown to growing inequality, political turmoil, and rising mental health issues. And she kind of feels the pressure is mounting, not only on her as a CEO, but on the whole organization. And this recent Edelman Trust Barometer, which you might have seen, kind of really hits her. Trust seems to be fading everywhere, but somehow business is the one institution people still relatively believe in. People want business to take a stance. And it's kind of funny, even Davos is now saying the same thing. Businesses must become a force for good if we want to have any chance of making the planet a little bit better. But the question is, what does this really mean? And how can we make it happen? How can we be sure that while we are delivering profit, as we have to and want to, we're also creating social value and help people to flourish within the organization and broader? And the CEO is kind of thinking, whatever the answer, it can never just come from the top. It has to come from all the people in the organization. And then the thought hits her, so to speak, to say, if it comes from all the people in the organization, I really need to talk to my HR director. So let's meet with the HR director to see if HR might already be a force for good. And here comes the HR director in the form of my good friend and colleague, Antoinette Weibel, professor of the University of St. Gallen. So HR director Antoinette, over to you.
Well, General, great question. From an HR perspective, performance management is, of course, our most important tool to shape people's behavior. As the handbook says, it's a structured way to align, motivate, and develop our people to achieve our goals. Traditionally, it includes 5 main practices: setting targets, giving regular feedback, conducting performance appraisals, and then following up with pay, rewards, and development. But honestly, I'm glad we are having this conversation, because really, I fear we have hit the limits of what performance management can really do. We've been working on improving every single routine forever, but it still falls short of unlocking our people's full potential, let alone make business a force for good. So I started to look into multiple surveys. And if you look at that, it's clear that performance management isn't even achieving the basics. From the organization's viewpoint, over 90% of organizations are dissatisfied with their appraisal systems. And only 23% believe these systems accurately reflect employee contributions. On the side of employees, only 14% feel that performance reviews inspire improvement, and fewer than 1/3 find that the review process is fair. And even more striking, from the HR perspective, things do not look better at all. A striking 98% of HR managers find yearly evaluations unhelpful, and 60% of HR executives rate their own performance management systems a grade of C or below. And rather than to make people flourish, performance management is primarily breeding dissatisfaction and despair. Gallup's recent workplace engagement survey backs this up. 72% of European employees are merely doing the minimum, so they abide to the rule, and 16% are even actively disengaged, and feelings of stress, anger, sadness, and loneliness are widespread. Gallup attributes much of this to performance management, which often fails to convey genuine appreciation and instead micromanages and coerces employees. It really seems that Tamra Chandler is right. Rather than improving our business, performance management seems to be killing performance. And that is, in a way, really strange considering how much effort we've put into it. Yet when we dig into the individual practices, there's plenty of evidence that highlights the flaws. So first, let's look at target setting. Lisa Ordonez's research shows us that SMART goals, while specific and focused, end up stifling creativity and mindfulness. And the demanded extreme ambition levels can lead to emotional depletion, gaming, faking, and even unethical behavior. Even the more modern approaches like OKRs and fast goals, though supposedly more agile, still carry these same issues. By pushing for even more ambitious and fast-paced targets, they might actually make things even worse. Well, next, feedback. Carol Sanford and Marcus Buckingham have both called for no more feedback, and meta-analysis back them up. Performance feedback often falls flat, and in many cases doesn't help at all. Newer tech-driven methods like daily pulse checks and up-based feedbacks can also have negative side effects, encouraging employees to focus on mainly managing impressions and keeping things secret. Interestingly, Ariel Klugel, who used to be the feedback advocate, has now shifted his focus to research on listening, finding that listening, rather than telling others what to do, is often the most effective approach. Third, and probably most problematic, is performance appraisal, whether through ratings or rankings. Recent studies make it clear that appraising complex as well as team-based work is rife with bias. Bias training doesn't solve it, changing the scales doesn't fix it, and 360 degrees feedback doesn't balance it out. Employees often feel unfairly judged, and they're often right. And not only is this process expensive, but it also has little to no correlation with actual business performance, leading to outcomes that are both arbitrary and costly. Fourth, individual variable pay. Dan Pink and others have pointed out how problematic this can be. It often creates perverse incentives, making people focus on what's rewarded rather than on what's mattering. This approach also undermines intrinsic motivation as well as pro-social and creative behaviors, by fostering at the same time faking, gaming, and unethical conduct, especially at the top. It also has hidden costs like increased burnout, absenteeism, turnover, and fees for compensation consultants. And by the way, it turns out that team-based bonuses can have their downsides too. In immature teams, these can contribute to bullying. Finally, people development. Recent research from 2024 still shows there is no reliable instrument to measure potential, which then of course means that tools like the 9-box grid are essentially just fairy tales. And although experience-based learning is widely acknowledged as the gold standard, most organizations avoid the extensive design, coaching, and reflection which is really needed to make it truly effective. But you didn't ask me if we're hitting our goals. You asked me if we were helping people to develop into responsible decision makers to make our business sustainable. And that's really much more about character rather than just alignment or motivation. Looking at the research, we might have a big issue here. Many of our current practices seem to be encouraging traits like greed, envy, anger, dishonesty, and superficiality, and whatnot more. Plus, we're often unintentionally promoting short-sightedness and discouraging deeper, more meaningful questions, which then leads to functional stupidity, rather than the reflexivity which we would need for genuine responsibility. And this brings us to another important insight. Our approach has been very scattered. We've been piling best practices on top of each other without ever really taking a step back to think about what kind of organization we really want to be. In other words, we focused on the why and the how, but we've overlooked the who. We haven't looked closely at how our performance management practices influence the kind of people we are becoming at work. If we really want to be a force for good, we need to start considering the character of our business. Otherwise, we risk just putting more lipstick on this rather ugly pig. So let's see if we can track down some transformation experts to help us with this puzzle.
And here come the transformation experts. And I have to say, that is a great challenge. And I'm really glad it's coming from HR, because walking around some recent HR conferences, I really got the strong impression that many colleagues seem to believe that transformation is just about rolling out new systems. But of course, when we talk about genuine transformation, the key question is always how to unlock a business's full potential. And here, it's clear that organizational structures and people practices matter, along with the type of people we have in the organization and how they relate to each other. But in my 30 or so years of experience, I've often found that we need to go a little bit deeper and start by examining the prevalent underlying business logic, or what we might call the business ideology. So what is this business ideology? Well, simply put, it's about how we view the world and what we believe our role is within it. And this includes our understanding of how things work and what we think really matters. And we can add a complexity lens to this. And then we could say that on the one hand, on the y-axis, we might view the world as stable and simple, or alternatively as complex and interconnected. And on the x-axis, we can either approach the world considering just one view, one perspective, or many different views and perspectives of different people and stakeholders. And I think it's very clear that depending on how we see the world, it will shape both our ends and our means, how we design and govern our organization, the operational or product choices that we make, the people we hire, and also how we interact with the entire ecosystem around us. But let's dive into this a bit more practically. And our hypothesis is that business can become a greater force for good if it is able to critically reflect, as Antoinette says, on its own ideologies and ways of working. And of course, we will bring our HR director along with us to discuss what all these different perspectives mean for performance management. So when we talk about business transformation models, we very often start with what I will call a machine ideology. And here it's pretty clear that the organization views the world as simple, closed, and stable, and the goals are unitary. And this is often the characteristic of what is called a bureaucratic or a red organization that cares mostly about tradition and very conservative values. And in this type of company, the primary objective, or that unitary goal, of course, is profit maximization or reliable service delivery, if it's a public service company, achieved mostly through a very strict hierarchy, standard products, formal procedures, and centralized control. And it operates exactly like this well-oiled machine that you see on the slide. And individuals are viewed as cogs in that machine that need to fit into their places. So if we take this type of perspective, HR director, what could this mean for performance management?
Well, when crafting a performance management system, we're typically faced with three critical questions. What constitutes performance? What are the drivers behind it? And how can it be scaled effectively? Plus, of course, we have this new challenge, character. So it seems to me that in this red paradigm, the answers are very clear. What defines performance? It's about efficiency, quality, predictability, and scale. What drives performance? Mostly it's a combination of hard skills based on formal qualifications and expertise, and reinforcement through extrinsic factors like hierarchical advancement, job security, and often significant fear of punishment. Thirdly, how do we scale? Through strict rules and roles, or in other words, by operating within a very limited freedom in a very tight frame.
Very limited freedom in a tight frame. That makes a lot of sense. And of course, most organizations have moved away from this machine worldview, which just cannot keep up with the rapidly changing markets and rising complexity in today's world. And instead, what we're seeing a lot is the shift to an organismic metaphor, or what is often called a complex adaptive system. And this is typically the view of what I would call a neoliberal kind of agile organization, which seeks to constantly adapt itself outside in, so to speak, to the outside world. And this type of organization is all about relentless change and market growth and the laser focus on customers. It's designed to thrive with this complexity, with shorter production cycles, creative diversity, and cross-functional teams, but it still sticks to a unitary goal of shareholder value to please very often very short-term kind of focused investors. Employees are now seen as human capital, which implies that we think about employees as highly individualistic, competitive, and motivated to win, which is embedded in a culture that prioritizes meritocratic and entrepreneurial spirit. So if we look at this paradigm, Antoinette, how are the performance management questions answered here?
Well, here expertise still matters, but the real emphasis is on the ability to adapt, innovate, and acquire new skills quickly. Performance is defined by speed, innovation, return on investment, and market metrics. What drives performance? Organizations strive to increase employee motivation by emphasizing autonomy, personal development, positive psychology, and of course bonuses and a wide range of perks from the free canteens to office gyms and meditation classes. How is performance scaled? Big, hairy, audacious goals, known as BHAGs, are cascaded to make the elephants dance, while people have autonomy to choose key results or backlog items. The model is based on flat hierarchies or micro-enterprises and lots of internal competition.
Great. So is our business already becoming better? Well, when it comes to, as Antoinette says, agility and energy, there's undoubtedly progress, but there are also evident challenges with responsibility when it comes to yellow ideology. And you might recall this chart from some of our presentations. We are saying that agile organizations often still perpetuate suffering simply because people are still instrumentalized in the name of profit. And despite all the rhetoric about liberation and freedom and autonomy, the power in agile organizations, if you look very closely, very rarely shifts. Shareholders and a select few executives at the top, especially in the finance department, still hold most of the control. So freedom here is primarily negative, which means it's freedom from coercion and freedom from interference. But it's also very limited because if you think about it, many people often lie awake at night trying to figure out how they can possibly meet the next budget or that important next deliverable. And we term this domination. And you can clearly see it here on the chart. Firstly, there's what we call horizontal domination, where all the enhancements in this agile paradigm ultimately serve to build human capital rather than nurture human beings. And secondly, this is compounded by what is called vertical dominations, where the shareholder interests trump those of all other stakeholders in the firm, which is called shareholder primacy. And of course, the neoliberal doctrine hinges on the belief that individual greed will lead to societal prosperity in a world of perfect competition, perfect information, perfect rationality, perfect everything. But of course, as we saw at the very beginning, that's not really how it works. There simply is no negative freedom without negative externalities. So in order to move us forward, we need to move to the right in our original ideology chart and embrace what I will call a political transformation. And this implies that we must strengthen the freedom of employees and other stakeholders, allowing them to thrive as equals with dignity and with respect. And interestingly, we can go to political theory here, which suggests three important tests that determine what is really the basic legitimacy of any societal organization. Firstly, the so-called eyeball test, ensuring that there's no horizontal domination within the organization and people truly interact as adults, as moral equals. Secondly, there's the so-called tough luck test, which I quite like, which challenges any potential vertical domination by discrimination or unfair processes or biased decisions. And this really means that if something happens to you in an organization which you're not entirely happy with, that you are attributing it to bad luck and not something that is structurally geared against you or the type of people or the class or the gender or whatever you might represent. And finally, the just profit test, which guards against external domination, stipulating that no company should profit at the expense of others. And this is really about internalizing externalities. all stakeholders, including nature, must be equally respected, which, using all these criteria, brings us to the third archetype, which is a political community. And organizations that adopt this type of metaphor care a lot for social justice and dignity, diversity and inclusion, as well as for sustainability. And importantly, this is more than just psychological safety. There's a real commitment, a hard commitment, which is embedded in institutions to a core set of liberties for everybody involved. It's grounded in a liberal constitution and makes sure that these organizations give all stakeholders a real voice and not just an ephemeral option to exit, which also implies that all the decision-making processes are becoming more democratic and participatory, fostering dialogue, moderation, and also shared governance. And also when it comes to the distribution of resources and roles in the organization, so think about career progressions and the likes, things become a lot more transparent and unbiased by design to ensure equality of access and social values. So what does this type of paradigm look like in terms of performance management, Antoinette?
Well, first and foremost, performance now involves holistic assessment, considering both shareholder and stakeholder metrics, including environmental sustainability and employee welfare. The goal is fair profit, not fake profits, which are ignoring externalities. Secondly, individuals are recognized as human beings with rights, not mere resources, and are given opportunities for personal growth and development. Crucially, employees are now motivated by a deeper sense of ownership and meaning, which fosters commitment and energy. In terms of scalability, the organizational culture carefully combines autonomy with heedful collaboration, and authority is structurally so distributed to prevent power concentration.
Great. Authority is structurally distributed to prevent power concentration. That's very interesting, isn't it? That's like in a modern democracy where we have different institutions that have checks and balances and control on each other to make good laws. And that's great. So are we a good organization yet? Well, not quite, but we are certainly making progress. So going back to this chart, we can see that horizontally, as Antoinette says, individuals now have substantive freedom to be authentic and pursue their individual careers. And we call that freedom to be. And vertically, all stakeholders are starting to be equally represented, and which also implies that we're starting to clean up some of the mess that we've created in that earlier red or yellow paradigm. But this really only makes us reach the net positive point in the middle. And if you think about it, not to gain at the expense of others, it doesn't always imply that we've totally stopped to produce products that might be unhealthy or unnecessary, think cigarettes, or that we're including all externalities in our profits, or indeed that we might be partnering with others to solve the society's problems which transcend individual organizations' scopes. In other words, we might be getting freer, but we are not yet socially collectively flourishing. And this is, of course, where things get quite complicated. And Antoinette and I have been diving into several millennia of moral philosophy and had to find out that flourishing is really a highly complex endeavor, in spite of its popularity and lots of people talking about it. Because firstly, it clearly goes beyond maximizing pleasure and minimizing pain, as in yellow utilitarianism, or indeed it goes beyond ensuring social justice and equal well-being, as in that orange republicanism. So it's neither just about outcomes, nor simply about adherence to rules. It's somehow about nurturing the inherent goodness that we all carry within ourselves. And maybe one way to look at it is as a path in pursuit of excellence, where we continually inquire into our role in the world and how to bring to life the best of human possibility in any given situation, applying those virtues and wisdom to navigate the conflicts and contradictions that we are faced with in our daily lives, to continually become through doing. So it's really, as Antoinette pointed out at the beginning, about who we become through our action, which gets us to the simple formula: flourishing is energy times excellence. It kind of harnesses motivation and freedom through meaningful and masterful work, which brings to life our highest potential, that famous telos. And here maybe it's important to notice that flourishing isn't simply about flow. Flourishing isn't merely kind of a better goal or a better feeling, but it's an ongoing practice. It's like training a muscle. It's about moral development and our capacity to actualize what we could call the essence of human goodness, of humanity, through ourselves in a present moment. And this is far deeper and more complex than some of the concepts that we are used to in positive psychology. And it always will depend on a specific context. So it's not a general rule. And by the way, here's maybe important to note, it's also not just about diversity. It's not simply about giving a voice to another person, but about a true commitment to the potential for good that resides in the other person. So it's not that just I make sure that Antoinette can have an equal share of the time on this podcast, but I'm making a personal commitment to help Antoinette to bring out the very best in what potential she has inside her, which is part of that beautiful potential that we all harbor as part of our shared humanity. And this is, I think, where you can already see by the example, the real challenge lies in recognizing that as humans, true flourishing only really occurs within a community of individuals who commit to each other and uplift each other, which finally leads us to what we will define as good organizations. And these are, of course, beautiful businesses, and here I'm very biased, but of course, also very rare. They aim at social value, not just profit. They don't want to be the best organization of the world. They want to be the best organization for the world. And they envisage the world as an evolving craft or a professional practice where organizations can almost act as commitment devices that enable us collectively to extend beyond ourselves and find fulfillment in our lives at work while contributing to an important higher purpose. Thus, finally, work is liberated from the instrumentalization that we had in red and yellow and transforms into an end in itself, which kind of helps us to foster the best in everybody involved. And it's quite clear that in such organizations, we can easily feel at home because we start to occupy a meaningful place in a social order that is mutually committed to combine mastery, the professional competence, and purpose, which is anchored in a common good. So, long story short, let's look at what this might mean for the people practices in performance management.
Well, important. It's now the manifestation of business excellence and social value, as well as a deep sense of personal fulfillment. So what drives performance here is quite simple. It's genuine care for the people within the organization, its broader ecosystem and society. People are driven by a deep commitment to bringing out the best in each other, to make the world better through their lives at work, actualizing their inherent potential. How do we scale? By fostering organizational wisdom through a reflexive governance that combines global purpose, local freedom, and whole system development.
That combines global purpose, common good, local freedom, the freedom that we saw in orange, and whole system development, where we're really looking at all the different levels, the individual, the organizational, the societal development as integrated. And that's interesting because it almost naturally gets us to a simple model that we can use for the deliberate, and I will almost call it vocational, business transformation, from the red to the yellow to the orange to the purple, from freedom to do to freedom to be, and finally freedom to become through action. And of course, these archetypes are not meant to be absolute, but it shows how the continual increase in organizational consciousness on the x-axis and a ever higher, so to speak, moral ambition and moral commitment on the y-axis can lead to a greater capacity to stay true to ourselves, to who we are and who we want to become, while we are navigating all those daily challenges of freedom versus responsibility, stability versus change, profit versus the social value, and ultimately create social flourishing through work. And I think here it's quite important to notice that we're not taking away the paradox, if you want, the necessity to deliberate about how much profit or how much social value we can create in every single organization. But as Antoinette pointed out, we're bringing the reflexivity back to have almost like a moral imagination to figure out what the best is that we can do, to also make sure that we're becoming the best whilst we're doing it. And I believe there's another very profound truth here, that we almost first have to gain our full freedom to be able to give it away, to give ourselves entirely, because otherwise the gift that we're giving might not be worth giving, right? Because we're not really free, we're almost forced to do it. But paradoxically, it's only through giving ourselves to something really important that we find that deepest meaning, that deepest anchor in our lives. To live a good life, we need not only freedom from, but also freedom for. Now, if this is directionally correct, the question, of course, becomes, how can we make it happen? And this brings us back to the beginning of the section. In order for organizational character to emerge, we need to develop the structures, the processes, the people and values, but we also need to pay very careful attention to the ideology. And this is often reinforced, especially through our governance processes and mechanisms and leadership. And this implies, by the way, both the corporate governance layer as well as the kind of executive or strategic governance layer within the organization. So only if we transform businesses holistically across all these different entities, if you want, we will see the emergence of what Antoinette mentioned as business excellence, and as a result, the social value, with flourishing as a byproduct. And maybe there's another point here. Ideology might be in our heads, but it is always reproduced and found in these social structures and the interactions between people. Hence, it's not enough to just craft a kind of grandiose new mission statement, a code of conduct, or what people always kind of mention, to develop growth mindsets. In fact, maybe, as the old adage says, we cannot really think ourselves into a new way of acting. We must act our way into a new way of thinking. And this is why I believe performance management is so important, because more than any other process, it, on the one hand, embodies the current business ideology, how we see the world, what our responsibility is, and how we value each other. On the other hand, it translates that into concrete habits and practices. So our idea is that HR, and ideal, is that HR can really punch above its weight by leveraging specific people policies and practices, but also at the same time by influencing leadership selection and development to accelerate transformational change.
Which of course leads us straight to the Flourishing Manifesto. And here I want to thank all the many peers who have contributed to its development. As you can see, the Flourishing Manifesto is modeled after the Agile Manifesto, but it goes further. The 4 core beliefs at the top directly relate to the holistic business transformation journey, which then are translated into a set of principles. On the left, we have some general principles related to performance management, and on the right, component-specific principles for each of the 5 key practices. Additionally, we have also highlighted some initial ideas about specific practices on page 2, as we will see later. So now let's imagine that you are an HR director who wants to use this approach. And always bear in mind that while we firmly believe that performance management can play a critical role in driving business transformation towards flourishing, it cannot do it on its own.
In fact, as we said earlier, we need to look at all the different entities inside the business system. But the question is, how can we apply this Flourishing Manifesto? And I think it's actually quite straightforward. First, we can use it as a diagnostic tool. Starting at the top, we can examine how our own practices, how we define performance, what quality of motivation we are cultivating, and how performance is scaled through our organizational designs and the way people collaborate, in order to identify our own dominant business ideology. How do we actually think, as exemplified by the way that we work? And on that basis, we can sit down with key stakeholders and maybe the coalition of the willing to reflect and challenge ourselves how we can possibly enhance social value and increase flourishing. And again, this is not simply about a new purpose statement or just setting a moral ambition. It's really important to go to the third step and the third stage, which is to put in place specific people practices to reshape the organization's character for the long term, ensuring that we align our habitual practices and procedures with the social responsibility and attention to the common good and the collective flourishing. And ideally, we do this continuously as some sort of triple loop learning that is embedded in our organizational governance processes, so that the organization continuously learns to see itself as an actor within that broader system and to actualize its potential to foster systemic and systematic well-being.
So let's use an example to bring the logic to life. We'll focus on pay and reward practices because they're both one of the most powerful and one of the most problematic elements in traditional performance management systems. When designing pay and reward system, we face a multitude of decisions, and the specific choices we make will directly reflect the underlying business ideology at play. So to begin, let's diagnose your current situation by reviewing the concrete practices that are in place, focusing on each of the colors. Whatever practices are prevalent in your organization provides you with a strong clue about the type of logic that shapes your decision making. In the first, the red model, everything is geared towards standardization, reliability, and hierarchy. Pay structures are designed to reinforce this standardization and therefore are not personalized but linked to the unit. Piece rate pay on the shop floor or salaries determined by position and function. Pay raise is linked to progress along the positional ladder. Also, in this model, there is no need for large pay differentials, only for clear salary progression along the positional ladder. So take note if your organization seems to lean heavily towards the red. The yellow model is very different. It's about relentless adaptation to the market, and it premises individuality, self-interest, and winning. Accordingly, pay is competitive and dependent on the profile of each person. It is frequently negotiated and renegotiated, and the best negotiators with the scarcest skill will win. Merit is most important in determining absolute pay levels and is ideally linked to market outcomes. In terms of specific practices, pay for performance is ubiquitous. High-powered incentives and share plans are used wherever possible to align executives with shareholders, of course. As a result, pay differentials are usually sky high, with CEO pay multiples beyond 300 times the median pay. Again, make a note in this case if this is your prevalent type. In moving beyond the yellow paradigm, our first aim is to moderate these excesses and ignite greater energy and commitment. In this framework, salaries typically exceed market rates and progression is based on skills, which signals trust and the organization's commitment to individual and mutual growth. Additionally, collective incentives, whether at the team level or through profit sharing, reinforce mutuality. Pay differentials are carefully adjusted to ensure a decent living standard for all and to prevent excessive inequality that wouldn't pass the eyeball test. And that's precisely why Principle 9 of the manifesto advocates for discontinuing individual bonuses and instead emphasizes profit sharing. It also aligns with the understanding that within complex systems, performance rarely hinges directly on individual merits.
So that gives us some idea of the diagnosis, and at this point, hopefully we understand quite well what our individual starting point is. Our assumption is that most organizations are somewhere between red and yellow, with some of them moving towards orange. So at this point, there needs to be a reflection, which is ideally, as I said, continuous, about how the organization could contribute to greater flourishing, but also to take more accountability and responsibility for some of the externalities or some of the bad effects that it has in the world. Does it need to invest more in the individuals? Or does it need to adjust and change and integrate the organizational goals? Does it need to look at how costs are calculated in the accounting systems and practices? There are lots of opportunities to ensure that we are constantly revising the way that we are working in order to kind of increase the potential that we individual in this organization have. And I think the premises and principle in the manifesto should provide some inspiration here as far as we are looking at people practices inside the company. And let me also point out again what Antoinette already mentioned, which is the second page of our manifesto, which will be continuously developed. And we are currently trying to pull together some more ideas on specific practices. And again, highlighting both the ones that we think are great and the others that we believe have never ever worked based on the research that we've done. And all of this you will find on the website. And of course, we'd love to hear from you. If you have any ideas or think about any organizations that we really should look into, please share that with us, either via leadershipsociety.world or just by LinkedIn or email.
Okay, so let's assume now that you had conversation with those key leaders in the organization and that there is some commitment to move beyond the yellow ideology. So how do the principles at the bottom of the manifesto translate into a specific pay and reward structure? With lots of great insights here from Tamra Chandler and Stephanie Hornung, we've developed an initial proposal. First, fixed pay is personalized and generous, reflecting individual skills and roles while maintaining fairness. Second, variable elements of pay elements are present but limited. Managers and peers can grant small rewards on the spot to swiftly acknowledge outstanding performance. Additionally, we propose high impact rewards, ideally at the team level, which recommendations here then can come from anyone, but they need to be validated by a committee of peers. Third, most importantly perhaps, we propose widespread adaptation of profit sharing and ownership among employees to promote fairness and encourage active participation. And lastly, non-monetary recognition should be frequent, incorporating input from peers or the community and aligning with shared purpose, team accomplishment, and virtues. These recommendations are also captured on the somewhat more provocative second page of our manifesto, which highlights practices we deem ineffective based on evidence across all paradigms, that's in the red fields, alongside those we believe could be valuable to catalyze the transformation in the green fields. So, which model is closest to your own organization?
And we were going to leave you with this question to ponder as an action follow-up from this conversation. And hopefully this kind of starts to explain how HR can become a driving force in connecting people practices and the broader transformation, which of course brings us to the final question. What does all of this mean for the role of HR? HR leaders must really find the courage to rethink their own roles if they want to help to shape the future of work. This, by the way, also implies that as HR leaders, we might need to challenge that initial CEO, because otherwise it's very, very problematic for anyone inside the organization to actually drive that change, especially if we're all really stuck in that red model. How can HR leaders, Antoinette, configure their role?
Well, most importantly, we firmly believe that HR leaders are in a strong position to take the lead in reshaping organizations toward the freedom to flourish. Not only are people practices the most important levers, but HR leaders have legitimacy in the board to act on behalf of the good of their employees. HR can do this by acting as a smart broker of steady progress, encouraging small changes in practices and building alliances with like-minded leaders to create excellence. Or, when HR has the influence, it can drive radical change from the front, much like many B Corps and social enterprises are aiming to do. Either way, we believe the priority is to address power imbalances within our organizations, making sure every voice is valued and every person has the basic freedom to flourish.
Every person has the basic freedom to flourish. And again, I think looking at what we don't normally look at with our agile transformations into likes, as Antoinette says, i.e. the power imbalances is a very important exercise that increases the reflexivity of good organizations. To sum it all up, the world's challenges demand, as far as we are concerned, a stronger sense of responsibility from all of us. That implies the supervisory boards, the regulators, the investors, the decision makers inside organizations, and us, the employees. Excellence in business is not just about what we produce, and certainly not simply about how much money we make, but it's ultimately about who we become through work. While traditional performance management has often overlooked this vital question, it also offers, I think, HR a genuine chance to catalyze transformation through the systemic cultivation of organizational character. And in this context, the Flourishing Manifesto is meant as a tool to help HR step beyond that typical business partner role and engage, develop, and foster responsible leadership throughout their business. And as we said last year, our work always also reflects who we are. It has the power to bring boundless joy or deep sorrow. Hence, what you do as leaders in HR, as leaders in the business, thoroughly matters. Join us on this campaign, and together, let's help people, organizations, and our planet to truly flourish. Thank you very much indeed, and speak to you all soon.